Hey everybody, welcome to Question and Answer Time number 31. I'm your host, Adam Neely. I'm here answering all of your questions about bass and music in general. So let's get started.
Question and Answer Time with
The Rusty Monkeys writes, "You should be a music teacher."
That's a great idea. It's almost as if that's exactly what I do here on this channel.
Seothis writes, "Here's a silly question. What would you do if you lost your hearing?"
Yeah, losing my hearing would be absolutely devastating as a musician, not just because, I wouldn't be able to hear and thus express myself through music, but also my professional career would be kind of dead in the water in a lot of ways. I mean, I suppose I could still make YouTube videos, but it would be very, very difficult. Now, it's something that I've thought a lot about before in the past. When I was younger, I read an article that basically said that 90% of the sensory information that our brain receives comes from the eyes, and the other 10% comes from the ears and other sensory organs, basically. And so I thought, of course, it would be absolutely the most devastating to go blind versus going deaf. Maybe I've sort of revised my thoughts on that, not just because I'm a musician now, but because of how I understand the world around me and how I generally feel about the world around me, because hearing really kind of makes you feel like you are part of a space. I'm going to switch now to my iPhone camera, and I'm going to continue talking using the audio from this nice microphone. And, the camera is like a worse quality than my normal camera right here that I've been talking to, but, you can still get a sense of like who I am right now, and it feels, I guess, more professional is the sort of term, I guess, for making a video. Now, if I switch this microphone off and start talking through the internal microphone on my camera, it all of a sudden loses its professional sheen. And this is something that is, I guess, important for a lot of people looking to make movies, and something that I thought about when I was seeing an acquaintance's film. It was a very, very well shot film. The cinematography was beautiful. It was an independent film that was being shown at a theater in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and I couldn't get over the fact that the audio in the film was just really garbage. It was really poorly recorded, and that sort of experience of watching that film has kind of taught me that our ears really make us feel like we're part of a room around us, and that's sort of something that I generally feel. It's something a little bit more visceral than sight. Now, of course, sight is incredibly important, and I feel like a deaf person can get around society a lot better than a blind person, but in terms of how connected you might feel to the world around you, I feel like for me personally, going deaf would be a lot more devastating. Now, in this segment of the Q&A, I want to actually just show 3 comments back to back, and then I kind of want to explain what my thoughts are on those comments.
Phil J. McKenzie writes, "It's kind of funny. Everyone expects classical musicians to be the elitists, but I can tell you, as a classical violin student, elitism is a lot more common in jazz."
Santiago writes,
"There's something similar that happens within the culture of an Uruguayan rhythm called candombe, which is played with 3 different kinds of drums: chico, piano, repique. A lot of people from the old guard resent its widespreading because they feel a lot of people don't respect the drums and the music enough. They insist that it should not be transcribed or written down or explained even, just learned by watching and hearing. I know where they come from and why they could feel that way, since it's one of the most fundamental aspects of Uruguayan culture, but personally, I don't share their views."
Ethan Iverson writes,
"Hi Adam, I've been admiring your videos. Thank you. A few commenters here are talking about how jazz musicians are elitist jerks. Well, that's probably true a lot of the time. However, I think the cutting session or jam session protocol is a hangover from the days of segregation. Black musicians didn't want to make it easy for white cats to steal the music. Also, if you were a young black musician, you were going out to represent for your race and needed to be tempered by flames from the elders. Between those 2 elements, it was important for both black and white musicians to show immediately that they could play when daring to sit in. The scenes of Eminem sitting in 8 Mile are possibly relevant to this discussion. I'm not saying that this kind of attitude should still be present at a casual jazz jam now, but that history might help explain how it came about. Taking this further to the 70s Real Book, there's definitely a discussion to be had about how black and white jazz artists are represented differently. Metheny, Swallow, Burton, etc. handed over their charts. No major black musicians did. Why would they? So Whitey could steal it? And as a result, the charts to heavy black jazz composers like Monk, Ellington, and Shorter are by far more inaccurate than the Bostonians or Bill Evans. Swallow's comment in Kernfeld's book that the changes to Ellington were correct at last is ludicrous. Thelonious Monk's name isn't even spelled right, let alone the changes to his compositions."
Now, I think the big takeaway that a lot of people had from my Real Book video was that jazz jam session musicians are kind of dicks. They're really kind of not very nice human beings, at least to other musicians. And they come across as just incredibly arrogant and just not who you want to hang out with, not who you want to play music with. And yet, at the same time, I have a very deep respect for what they are trying to do, which is to hold jazz to a very high standard of play, not to dilute it, not to take any sort of shortcuts and understanding, and really approaching the music with a deep reverence and humility, which is something that a lot of people don't really. They come into it thinking that jazz is purely about freedom of expression and anything that you do is great. And that's, one comment that I got a lot is like, jazz is freedom of expression, but not a whole lot about the many different sorts of steps necessary in order to achieve that freedom and at least communicate in a real meaningful way with fellow musicians. And of course, there's a huge racial element to this. There definitely can be an element of privileged white jazz bros trying to take over jazz music for themselves. That's why that comment about the Uruguayan musicians sort of really resonated with me, because it really reminded me of what a lot of people in jazz jam sessions sometimes try to do. Now, whether or not they are successful at protecting the institutions of jazz and protecting the traditions of jazz, I'm not necessarily sure they are doing that. But I definitely respect the sentiment, and that's something to really go into this discussion thinking about. Nick Krueger writes,
Hey Adam, I recently watched an interview that Chris Thile did with the Wall Street Journal where he predicts that, in the near future, musicians will do so much hopping between genres and fusing different musical styles that it will no longer be genre hopping. It will just be plain good music, borrowing from so many styles that genre labels don't even really apply to it anymore. Chris Thile is of course known for fusing a wide array of genres in his music, from bluegrass to classical to pop to alternative rock. Can you think of any other artists who have a similar mindset towards breaking genre boundaries? What kinds of fusion genres work best for you? Classical plus bluegrass, black metal plus shoegaze, jazz plus funk, blues plus punk,
So I know what Chris Thile was talking about, definitely. Definitely in his music, because he has very genre-bending tendencies himself. And, it used to be in the previous generation, the music that you listened to was kind of like your subculture. So metal musicians all hung out and they listened to metal together, and shame on you for listening to any folk music, because metal musicians don't listen to folk music. And that's, definitely not the case these days. You can listen to metal and jazz and folk and whatever. You can listen to anything because your culture is not necessarily tied to the music that you listen to. But I don't think that music is going to be this homogenous, single genre of music. I don't think that's going to happen, because humans really like labels. We love creating labels for things. Just look on the Wikipedia list for metal genres, subgenres, electronic music subgenres, jazz subgenres. There's so many of them, because people like identifying elements in music and coming up with a label for them. The reason why labels are so nice for people and why people create them is because they create a sense of how you are supposed to listen to the music when you first approach it. And sometimes musicians hate that. In fact, most musicians really hate that, which is why we don't like labels, we don't like genres or whatever, but listeners love it. That's something to keep in mind when you're a musician, is to try and really think about how you want a listener to approach your music. So I consider myself an electronic jazz bass player. That gives some sort of expectations, and maybe some people disagree with those expectations of how they'll approach my music, but that's something that I sort of think about for an elevator pitch to a listener. So I know where Chris Thiele's coming from, but I don't think that's ever going to really happen.
Sarah Nokomis writes, Adam, I'm currently doing some self-study of music theory at the college level, working through Tonal Harmony by Koska and Payne. And I was wondering if you knew of any similar texts on the topic of jazz harmony at a college/post-college level.
So one book that I generally like using is Modern Jazz Voicings by Ken Pullig. It's pretty good for at least the advanced jazz harmony stuff, but if you really want to get into some of the nitty-gritty of jazz harmony analysis, the Jazz Piano Book by Mark Levine sometimes is a good resource that I'll use. Honestly, if you want to be sneaky about it, go online and look up Berklee College of Music harmony textbooks, because they come in these loose leaf packets, and I do know that people will sell them secondhand. You can only really buy them at the Berklee College of Music bookstore, because they change every semester and they just have these loose leaf packets. But I do know people that sell them, so maybe check those out, because those, the Berklee curriculum is quite extensive in how it approaches jazz harmony. So those are some ideas.
Arturo 5 writes, meh. One disagreement, I think a high-frequency metronome stands out better than a low-frequency metronome. There's less mud up there, so it's easier to hear the click, or whatever. Each person is different, though. No single standard or rule applies to everyone.
So the nice thing about science is that it does not care whether or not you disagree with it or not. It just doesn't. It only cares about the scientific method. So if you found some sort of flaw in the methodology of this study that said that timing errors are better perceived in lower frequencies versus higher frequencies, that's fine. You should probably email the writers of this study because they probably should know about this. But it seems like you're just saying that, well, I can hear higher pitches in metronomes, which isn't even the point of the study. It's just that we can hear timing mismatches a lot clearer in the lower frequencies for a variety of reasons, perhaps evolutionary. But there is this negative mismatch, or this mismatch negativity in human brains whenever it occurs. And that's the thing, man. Science sometimes goes contrary to maybe your vision of what the world is, to conventional wisdom. And that's fine. That's how we progress. And that's how we can understand more about ourselves and more about our minds, learn more about music, in fact. Embracing that can be really useful. And this isn't even that controversial of a subject, honestly. It's something that honestly confirms a lot of biases and maybe elucidates new sorts of meanings and why we have those biases. So think about that before you immediately attack a scientific study just because you don't necessarily agree with a premise that you kind of got wrong otherwise. And I might be picking on this one commenter, but it's something that I have gotten almost a lot of blowback sometimes for quoting all of these scientific studies. It's interesting, to say the least.
Jed Manual 91 writes, Adam, big fan here. Perhaps the following questions would fit in your next Q&A. If the Simandl book is the Bible/Quran for the upright bass, what would be the holy book for the electric bass?
So it really doesn't exist yet, because the electric bass is a very new instrument, and Simandl wrote his method at a time when the upright bass, such as it was then, was several hundred years old in various forms. And it was continually evolving the same way that the electric bass is still evolving now. So I'm not necessarily sure if somebody's ever going to write the one true book for electric bass when, there's so many different kinds of styles of approaching the bass. And, the methodology and sort of pedagogy of teaching bass is not necessarily the same as it was back then, back when Simandl wrote his method. I know Stanley Clark was trying to write one at some point, and maybe some other people are going to write one. Maybe I'll write one someday. I don't know. I do think that Simandl is extremely useful for people who are studying electric bass. So definitely try and embrace a lot of the things that can teach you. It's not the be-all end-all, and it certainly isn't the be-all end-all for upright basses, but, it's a very useful tool anyway for you as a learning bassist.
Procrast writes, apart from the new age stuff, this was pretty nice. Thank you.
I know when I talk about some of the things in my Berkeley senior recital video that are a little bit more philosophical or quasi-religious, it might seem a little bit new agey, but trust me, I am trying to approach it from the most practical standpoint possible. It's something that I think about a lot. Whenever you're very scientifically minded, very analytically minded, it can sometimes be hard to lift yourself up over what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis and see the broader picture of things, or how you might relate to the material that you're studying. And when you ask a scientist or ask a mathematician why they get excited about something that they're working on, they'll always say, like, it's interesting, it's new, and above all, it's beautiful to me. But I want to kind of almost like take a deeper lens on why something's beautiful, why you might be interested in it, what's your relationship to the material that you're studying, because that sort of deep analytical lens can be turned on different things that not necessarily a purely analytical Apollonian sort of view of the universe and the world around you. So that's my take on the new aginess. I know it might seem like I'm getting a little bit out into la-la land sometimes, but trust me, if you really think about it, I'm trying to keep everything very grounded and very much applicable to people in the real world.
Arturo Senni writes, this video is absolutely and utterly useless. Congratulations.
Well, I appreciate that, but remember this, all knowledge is completely and utterly useless until it's not. Think on that.
Royniel Perez writes, why do we almost never hear any bass solos in jazz?
Because bass solos suck.
Oh my God, I can't believe you said that.
For some reason, smashing the keyboard caused Louis Armstrong's La Vie en Rose to start playing. So, serendipitous. No bass solos in that song, by the way.
WatchMeSuffer writes, hey, question for your Q&A. Have you heard of any jazz groups that utilize beatboxing? If not, do you think it could work? Generally, groups try not to substitute the drum set for anything, but maybe there's potential for a more hip-hop flavored kind of sound.
Yeah, I have heard it used. There's actually this really awesome video that I'm going to link to in the description of this thing called the 10th Apartment Sessions, I think it's called, with Gene Shinozaki, who's the featured beatbox guy. And it's this great like blend of jazz, hip-hop, like modern classical third stream. Like there's this bassoon player and string section and horn section and all this crazy stuff all crammed into one like tiny apartment, and it's awesome. You should definitely check it out. It is really forward thinking. And actually Chris Thile, I think, shared it on his Facebook. So there we go. Bringing back the Chris Thile theme. Chris Thile theme. That is fun to say. Chris Thile theme.
TheMaykarLocomotive writes, how did you choose your haircut?
Yes, my haircut is a holdover from when I was kind of poor, and I figured that this was a good way of saving money. Instead of going to get my haircut every 3 weeks, I would just shave my head, buy clippers for $20 and be done with it. And, you know, a lot of musicians do some pretty crazy things when they're poor. I wouldn't recommend the Yannick Guazdala method of Sour Patch Kids plus seltzer water. I think he mentioned that somewhere. You know, when I was a lot poorer in New York City, I would eat a lot of rice, a lot of beans, a lot of peanut butter. I still do that, actually. Again, old habits die hard. To keep, you know, a sort of more frugal lifestyle going. You know, you might have to rough it for a little bit if you're trying to be a professional musician, but, you know, at the same time, you don't have to starve to death. A starving musician is not really a trope, but you might have to live with a kind of a weird haircut for a while. And I guess I still do. So that's the story of my haircut.
Davis Miles writes, question for next Q&A. When did you really start gigging as a musician? Was it high school, when you were at Berklee Manhattan School of Music? Is it more important in college to try and get gigs or focus on your studies until you leave college and then start gigging regularly?
So gigging when you're in school is something that sort of naturally occurs. And, you know, a lot of schools actually encourage it. I know at Manhattan School of Music, I think one of the pitches was in the jazz program, there were never going to be any classes before 9 a.m. because they kind of assumed that students would be playing late into the evening. Yeah, I mean, it's something that will happen sort of naturally because you're in an environment, hopefully in a big city, which will naturally give you the opportunities to play. Now, the big question is, if you get so much work and start gigging so much, should you stay in school? And that is a question that, you know, a lot of people will have to answer for themselves, and will be fortunate to answer for themselves because, you know, maybe some people like myself will have to be cursed with graduating. You know, it was almost considered for a while to be a badge of honor to not have graduated from Berklee, to have enough work or have enough of a prestigious gig to be able to drop out. It's kind of not necessarily the case anymore, but it does happen.
Dins Navarro writes, came for the bass, stayed for the music. Hey Adam, a quick question. What thickness in bass strings do you prefer? Love your videos, man. Keep up.
So yeah, I'm playing like medium light strings. I think it's like 100 to 40, and I'm playing with a kind of like a medium high-ish action. You know, the thing with hanging out with Evan Marion on that Q&A live stream was that playing his basses, geez, those basses were easy to play. It was like anything I could think of just like flew out of my fingers, and it was amazing. It was a really powerful feeling. I was like, oh my God, I could be a jazz fusion shredder. Not that I, you know, have dreams of doing that necessarily, but something that I, you know, maybe I want to do. Maybe I want to be a jazz fusion shredder when I'm playing his basses, because I can work out all these ideas. The problem is that like when you're playing a bass that has super low action and super light gauge strings, he had like 30s or something ridiculous for his G string, the notes just kind of crap out on you when you're digging in for like a lot of the kinds of, you know, more rock oriented music or some kind of music that needs a little bit more oomph and thump behind it. The basses didn't have any thump to them. And I like a little bit thump in my sound, in my playing. And so, you know, I wouldn't... It's something that I really cater to my personal sort of approach to understanding what it is I like out of my instrument. And it's a struggle. It's always going to be a struggle, and you should always be thinking about it because it's always going to evolve. So those are my thoughts on string gauge and action.
Adam Neely writes, well, I remember trying to buy a real book from a music store and being told that they didn't carry it until my friend's bass teacher came out of the back and told the owner I was okay.
So that parallels my experience pretty much exactly. I went with my bass teacher into Dale Music in Silver Spring, Maryland. It doesn't exist anymore, so they cannot get in trouble for this, but went in and he was like, this young man needs a real book. And they were like, sure. And they went in the back and brought out a real book. And it was like I think $35, kind of expensive compared to the ones that are legal now, which I think are selling for $20 on Amazon. So that was one of the main reasons why legal versions are so popular, is because they're cheaper and they're legal. So there's no real reason to buy the illegal kind. So they're kind of starting to become a little bit more of a collector's item. So if you have an illegal one, hold on to it, because it might be a collector's item at some point. But then I guess you couldn't sell it at auction. Maybe you have to wait 90 years for all the copyrights to expire. I don't know. Law is complicated.
Torchcast Alt writes, so I'm a composer and still learning. I recently heard that you should avoid parallel fifths, parallel octaves, and even parallel fourths in voice leading. The theory is that the voices blend together too much and remove harmonies, or something along those lines. The thing is that in non-Western music, pre-classical music, and more contemporary music, there are a lot of these, so I don't completely understand why. To test this, I tried making a song that is full of parallel perfect intervals, and it doesn't sound bad at all to me. So I was really curious, what's your take on this, considering you are more musically educated and experienced than I am?
The main thing to understand about parallel fifths and all this rule about parallel constants and parallel octaves is it's all to achieve a certain sound. The sound that we're talking about is a very particular sound associated with counterpoint in the Baroque era, also the Renaissance era and the classical era, and Romantic composers started moving away from it. And so when you're using parallel fifths, you're adapting a much more modern sort of sensibility than maybe Bach would have used, and that's okay. And to us, it sounds fine. And like one thing that I've talked about in previous videos is that for us, we actually need parallel fifths for a lot of certain particular sorts of sounds and aesthetics that we've developed. For example, the parallelism in big band jazz arranging and jazz harmony. Duke Ellington wouldn't be able to write the jazz music that he needed to write without the use of parallel fifths. The same way for rock and roll, parallel fifths. Power chords are parallel fifths. There's these different kinds of aesthetics that are much more modern that our ears are able to accept. But if you're trying to get that specific sort of sound, parallel fifths are not good for that. Think about that when you're trying to compose. It's not something necessarily to avoid, but you're not going to achieve a certain sound if you use them. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. This has been question and answer time number 31. If you enjoy what I do here on this channel, please consider joining my Patreon, because it's my patrons over at Patreon that let me do this week after week. I have a new video coming out every Monday, so please consider clicking that subscribe and that ring button. And until next time,
Bass.